My parents gave my golden child sister their house, retirement savings, and entire inheritance. Then she stole everything and they came begging to live with me. Everyone says you should forgive your family. I tried for 28 years. Until the people who spent my entire life treating me like I didn't matter called me in the middle of the night, begging me to save them from the daughter they always loved more. And I hung up. I know that sounds cruel, but if you knew what they did to me, you'd probably have done the same. I grew up as the easy child, not because I behaved, because no one cared enough to notice if I didn't. My older sister, Ashley, was the princess. Straight A's, cheer captain, student council. Every family gathering sounded the same. Look at Ashley. We're so proud of Ashley. Ashley is going places. Then someone would remember I existed. Oh, and Michael's doing fine. That was my entire childhood. My parents never hit me, never screamed at me. Honestly, sometimes I wished they had. At least that would have meant they noticed me. Instead, I got indifference. When Ashley wanted piano lessons, they paid thousands. When she wanted horseback riding, they bought equipment. When she wanted a car for her 16th birthday, Dad traded in his truck so she could have a newer one. My 16th birthday, Mom handed me a used calculator. She smiled. This should help with school. No cake, no dinner, nothing. Ashley got a surprise vacation to Florida 3 months later. I started working when I turned 15. Fast food, then grocery stores, then landscaping. I paid for my own clothes, my own school supplies, my own phone. Whenever relatives asked why, Mom laughed. We're teaching Michael responsibility. Funny. Ashley somehow never needed that lesson. The moment I graduated high school, my parents gave Ashley $25,000 for college. I got a hug. Dad smiled. You're a man now. You'll figure it out. I remember standing there wondering, did they even realize what they'd just said? Apparently, they did, because that was exactly what they expected. Figure it out yourself. So I did. I skipped college, worked construction, 6 days a week, sometimes 7, shared a tiny apartment with 3 roommates, ate instant noodles almost every night, saved every dollar, while Ashley posted pictures from Europe, New York, Disney, luxury restaurants, every trip paid for by Mom and Dad. Relatives commented things like, you deserve it. Meanwhile, I couldn't afford new work boots. The funny thing, I never hated Ashley. Not then. She didn't ask to become the favorite. At least, that's what I told myself. Until she started believing she actually deserved everything. The first time I realized who she really was, I was 22. Dad called. Your sister needs help. Her rent was behind. Could I lend her $2,000? I almost laughed. I had exactly $2,300 in my savings account. 5 years of saving. Dad promised, you'll get it back. I believed him. I transferred the money. I never saw a single dollar again. When I asked about it 6 months later, Ashley rolled her eyes. Oh my God, you're still thinking about that? You have a job. You'll make more. I looked at my parents. Surely, they'd say something. Instead, Mom sighed. Don't make everything about money. I realized something in that moment. To them, my money was family money. Their money belonged to Ashley. That was the day I stopped expecting fairness. I worked harder. Got promoted, eventually became a project manager. Bought my first little house at 26. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, tiny backyard. But every nail, every payment, every piece of furniture was mine. For the first time, I felt proud. Then my parents showed up, unannounced. Mom walked through my house, looking around. She smiled. It's cute. Cute. I'd spent nearly 10 years working 80-hour weeks, and my dream home was cute. Then Ashley walked into my kitchen, opened my refrigerator without asking, looked around, and laughed. Still buying generic brands? I laughed too, because if I didn't, I would have thrown her out. Before leaving, Dad said something strange. You know, one day this house will stay in the family. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I wish I had, because 6 months later, they asked me the question that changed everything. And it wasn't a request. It was a demand. Last time I left off, my parents had just asked me to come over for a family discussion. Those 3 words should have been my first warning. Nothing good in my family ever started with family discussion. Still, I went. Because despite everything, a part of me still hoped they wanted to reconnect. Maybe apologize. Maybe finally admit they'd treated me differently. I should have known better. When I arrived, Mom already had coffee waiting. Dad was unusually cheerful. Ashley was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through her phone. She didn't even look up when I walked in. Mom smiled. We're so proud of you. I almost laughed. Those were words I'd waited my whole childhood to hear. Too bad they came with strings attached. We spent 15 minutes making small talk. Dad asked about work. Mom asked how I liked my neighborhood. Ashley complained about how expensive apartments had become. Then Dad cleared his throat. So, we've been thinking. Whenever my dad started a sentence like that, it usually meant he'd already made a decision, one that somehow involved me. Ashley finally looked up from her phone. I found the perfect condo. She turned her screen toward me. It was gorgeous. Modern kitchen, huge windows, downtown location. I whistled. Looks expensive. She nodded. About $380,000. I smiled. Hope you can save up. Nobody laughed. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We were thinking, since you already have a house, you could help your sister. I frowned. What kind of help? Dad answered before Mom could. Co-sign the mortgage. I blinked. I'm not doing that. The room went silent. I hadn't even needed a second to think. Ashley rolled her eyes. Wow. You didn't even consider it. I shrugged. Because if you stop paying, I'm responsible. She crossed her arms. I wouldn't stop paying. That would have been more convincing if she hadn't already borrowed $2,000 from me 4 years earlier. Money I'd never seen again. Dad leaned forward. She's family. I nodded. So am I. Silence. Again. It was funny. Whenever family needed something, I was family. Whenever I needed anything, I was an adult who should figure it out. Mom tried another approach. It wouldn't cost you anything. I actually laughed. If that's true, then why don't you co-sign? Neither of them answered. Instead, Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Our credit isn't good enough. That told me everything. The bank had already looked at Ashley's finances and said no. Now they wanted to use mine. I stood up. I can't do it. Ashley slammed her hand on the table. I knew you'd make this about yourself. I stared at her. About myself? I'm the one being asked to take the risk. She scoffed. You've always been jealous of me. I almost choked. Jealous? She'd been handed nearly everything. I'd worked for every dollar I had. If anything, I was tired, not jealous. Dad's voice became colder. Sit down. I stayed standing. No. He sighed. I thought you cared about your sister. There it was, the guilt, their favorite weapon. I looked him straight in the eyes. I cared enough to lend her $2,000. She never paid me back. Mom immediately jumped in. You're still holding that over her? I couldn't believe it. Still? It was my money. Ashley laughed. Oh my God, it was only $2,000. Only. That word hit me harder than anything else she'd said. Only $2,000. To her, it was nothing. To 22-year-old me, it had been years of overtime, skipped meals, second jobs, no vacations, no weekends, no life. I looked around the room. Not one person looked embarrassed. Not one. That's when I realized I wasn't sitting at a table with 3 adults. I was sitting with 3 people who genuinely believed I owed Ashley something. 4 existing. I walked toward the front door. Dad called after me. If you leave, don't expect us to ask again. I turned around. I hope you don't. Then I left. For almost 6 months, none of them contacted me. No birthday text, no holiday invitation, nothing. Honestly, it was peaceful. I focused on work. My boss noticed. I got another promotion. The extra income let me renovate my house. New floors, fresh paint. A proper backyard deck for the first time in my life. I stopped waiting for my family's approval. I didn't need it anymore. Then, one Saturday morning, someone knocked on my front door. It was Ashley, alone. She was crying. I'd never seen her cry before. For a split second, I actually felt sorry for her, until she opened her mouth. You ruined my life. I stared at her. What? If you had just co-signed, I would have gotten the condo. Instead, she'd taken out several high-interest personal loans, trying to prove she could afford it. The deal fell through anyway. Now she owed tens of thousands of dollars, with nothing to show for it. Somehow, that was my fault. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You made those choices. She shook her head violently. No, you forced me. I actually looked behind me to see if she was talking to someone else, because there was no way a grown woman believed that. But she did. Every word, every excuse. She truly thought the world owed her, because our parents had spent her entire life teaching her exactly that. I told her I was sorry things had turned out that way, but I wasn't paying her debts. She wiped away her tears. Then her face changed. The crying stopped. The sadness disappeared. And for the first time, I saw the person hiding underneath. Cold, entitled, almost angry that I had dared to say no. She looked me dead in the eye and said, You think that house is yours. It won't be forever. Ashley stood at the end of my driveway, smiling. Not the kind of smile someone gives when they're happy, the kind that says, You'll regret this. Then she got into her car and drove away. I remember standing there thinking, she's bluffing. What could she possibly do? The house was in my name. I paid every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every repair. Legally, there was nothing she could touch, or so I thought. A week later, my aunt called me, not to catch up, not to ask how I was doing. The first thing she said was, Michael, how could you? I frowned. What are you talking about? She sighed. Your parents told us everything. They said Ashley begged you for help. And you laughed in her face. I almost dropped my phone. Laughed? I never. She cut me off. I expected better from you. Then she hung up. That wasn't the only call. Over the next few days, my cousins stopped replying to my messages. My uncle unfriended me online. Even my grandmother left me a voicemail saying, family should stick together. I couldn't understand it. It felt like everyone had heard the same story, a story I wasn't part of. Finally, my younger cousin Daniel called. Unlike everyone else, he actually asked for my side. Did you really refuse to help Ashley? I did, but not the way they're saying. I explained everything. The unpaid loan, the cosign request, the guilt, the years of favoritism. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. They never told anyone about the loan. Of course, they didn't. Instead, they painted me as the successful son who had forgotten where he came from. The selfish brother who wouldn't lift a finger. The cold-hearted man who cared more about money than family. And people believed it, because my parents had spent decades building the image of the perfect family. No one wanted to believe there were cracks underneath. For a while, I considered calling every relative, explaining everything, showing bank records, text messages, proof. Then I stopped myself. People who wanted the truth would ask. The ones who had already judged me weren't looking for facts. They were looking for someone to blame. So I let them. A few months passed. Life became quiet again. Actually, better than quiet. Peaceful. Work was going great. I was finally sleeping well. No random calls asking for money, no guilt trips, no drama. Then one afternoon, Dad called. His voice sounded different, older, softer. Can we meet? I hesitated. What for? I just want to talk. That sentence would have meant something years ago. Now, it meant absolutely nothing. Still, curiosity got the better of me. We agreed to meet at a small diner halfway between our houses. When I arrived, Dad was already there, alone. For the first 10 minutes, he talked about everything except why he'd called. The weather, football, gas prices. Finally, I asked, so what did you really want? He stared into his coffee, then quietly said, I updated my will. I wasn't expecting that. He slid a folded envelope across the table. I wanted you to know before anyone else. I opened it. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. Then my eyes found the numbers. Ashley would receive the family home, their vacation cabin, Dad's retirement investments, Mom's jewelry, their savings, almost everything. I kept reading. My name appeared once. One line. Michael will receive my grandfather's toolbox. That was it. I looked up. Dad watched me carefully, almost like he was waiting for me to explode. Instead, I folded the paper, pushed it back toward him, and smiled. If that's what you want, I hope it makes you happy. Dad blinked. That's it? I shrugged. It's your money, your property. You can leave it to whoever you want. He looked disappointed, almost confused, like he'd expected me to fight, beg, argue. I did none of those things, because here's the truth. By then, I'd already accepted something. Their approval wasn't hidden inside an inheritance. It never had been. No amount of money could fix 28 years of feeling unwanted. I'd already built my own life. So if they wanted to leave everything to Ashley, they could. I wasn't going to compete anymore. Dad frowned. You don't seem upset. I smiled again. I'm not. That answer bothered him more than anger ever could have. As I got up to leave, he said quietly, you know, everything we've done was to keep the family together. I stopped walking, then turned around. No, you kept Ashley happy. Those aren't the same thing. Then I left. About 3 weeks later, my cousin Daniel called again. This time he sounded nervous. You need to know something. What is it? I wasn't supposed to hear this, but your parents are talking about selling their house. That surprised me. They've lived there for 30 years. I know. They said Ashley needs the money more. I felt my stomach tighten. Sell the family home? The house Dad had always said would stay in the family? For Ashley? At first, I thought maybe they were just downsizing. But Daniel lowered his voice. No, they're selling it. So they can help Ashley buy an investment property. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She still hadn't learned from the condo disaster, and instead of letting her face the consequences, my parents were doubling down, putting everything they had on the line, again. I almost called Dad. Almost. Then I remembered something he told me years earlier. You're a man now. You'll figure it out. So I figured this out too. I stayed out of it. It wasn't my decision. It wasn't my money. And for the first time in my life, I let them live with the consequences of their own choices. Those choices were about to destroy everything they'd spent decades building. A month after my meeting with Dad, the for sale sign went up in front of my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in, the one Dad swore he'd never leave. Within a few weeks, it was sold. Just like that. 30 years of memories gone. Not because they had to, because Ashley had convinced them it was an investment in their future. According to my aunt, Ashley had found an incredible opportunity, a small apartment building, 4 units. She claimed it would generate enough rental income for everyone to retire early. Mom couldn't stop talking about it. Our daughter is finally becoming a businesswoman. Dad even bragged about it at family gatherings. See, we always knew she'd do something big. I just smiled and nodded. Inside, I had a bad feeling. Ashley had never managed money well. Now she was suddenly a real estate investor? It didn't add up. A few weeks later, I ran into Daniel again. He asked if I'd heard the latest news. I shook my head. They sold more than the house. What do you mean? They cashed out Dad's retirement account. I stared at him. All of it? He nodded. And Mom sold most of her jewelry. I couldn't believe it. They hadn't just helped Ashley. They bet their entire future on her. Every dollar they'd spent decades saving was now in her hands. For a while, everything looked perfect. Ashley started posting pictures online. Fancy restaurants, designer clothes, weekend trips. She captioned one photo, "Hard work pays off." That almost made me laugh. Hard work? The only hard work she'd ever done was convincing other people to pay for her life. Family members loved it. Comments poured in. So proud of you. We always knew you'd succeed. Even people who hadn't spoken to me in months were sharing her posts. It was like she'd become the family's newest success story. Meanwhile, I kept going to work every morning, paying my bills, living my life, quietly. Then something strange happened. Ashley stopped posting. No pictures, no updates, nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. People disappear from social media all the time. But then, Mom stopped posting too. Then Dad. The silence felt unusual. About 2 months later, my phone rang while I was at work. It was Dad. I almost didn't answer. Something told me I should. The moment I picked up, I knew something was wrong. His voice was shaking. Michael, I need to ask you something. I stayed quiet. After a few seconds, he finally said it. Have you talked to Ashley? No. Why? There was a long pause. Then he whispered, we can't find her. I thought I misheard him. What do you mean you can't find her? She isn't answering her phone. She left her apartment. The realtor says she never showed up to the closing on the investment property. None of it made sense. What investment property? Dad went silent. Then, almost embarrassed, he admitted something. There wasn't one. I felt my chest tighten. What? The documents? They were fake. The realtor was fake. The contracts? Fake. Everything. Fake. Ashley had spent nearly a year convincing my parents she was buying an apartment building. She showed them glossy brochures, professional-looking paperwork, even took them to meetings. Every single piece of it had been staged. The money they'd given her never went toward real estate. It went straight into her personal bank account. Dad sounded like he was about to cry. We don't understand. She wouldn't do this. I closed my eyes, because unlike him, I understood perfectly. Ashley had spent her whole life learning one lesson. If she wanted something, Mom and Dad would give it to her. No questions asked. No consequences. Why would she suddenly stop? I asked the obvious question. How much? Dad didn't answer. I repeated myself. How much money did she take? When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. Everything. Everything. The house, the retirement account, the savings, Mom's jewelry. Even money they'd borrowed against their life insurance. Millions? No. But enough to erase decades of work. Enough to make two people in their 60s start over from nothing. Then Dad said something that stunned me. We thought maybe she came to you. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. After everything, they still thought Ashley would choose me. No, I haven't seen her, Dad sighed. We've reported her missing. I asked quietly. Did you tell the police she took your money? Silence. Finally, he admitted. We told them it was a misunderstanding. Of course they did. Even now, they were protecting her. A week later, the truth finally came out. Ashley wasn't missing. She'd planned everything months in advance. Closed her bank accounts, changed her phone number, applied for a passport, booked a one-way flight overseas. She had disappeared, with every cent they had, and she never looked back. For the first time in my life, my parents had no one left to blame but themselves. But instead of accepting that, they did what they'd always done. They looked for someone else to fix the mess. And this time, that someone was me. One rainy night, my phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. It was Mom. She was crying so hard, I could barely understand her. Michael, please. We have nowhere to go. For a few seconds, I just sat there in silence. Not because I didn't hear her. Because I'd imagined this moment more times than I'd like to admit. Growing up, I'd always wondered what it would take for my parents to finally need me. Turns out, losing everything to the daughter they loved more was the answer. Where's Ashley? I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear Mom say it. Another long pause. Then, we don't know. That was the first time I'd ever heard fear in her voice. Real fear. Not disappointment. Not frustration. Fear. Dad took the phone. We've been staying in a motel. Our savings are gone. We can only afford another 2 nights. Then came the question I'd been expecting. Can we stay with you? I looked around my living room. The house I'd bought without their help. The house they'd once called cute. The house Ashley had smiled at while saying, it won't be yours forever. Now, it was the only roof they had left. I wish I could tell you I immediately said no, but I didn't, because despite everything, they were still my parents. So I told them, you can stay, but only temporarily. Dad almost broke down. Thank you. You won't regret this. Looking back, those were probably the most ironic words he'd ever spoken. They moved in 2 days later. They didn't bring much. A few suitcases, some photo albums, 2 folding chairs, 30 years of their lives reduced to what fit inside my spare bedroom. Mom looked exhausted. Dad looked 10 years older. For the first couple of days, everything was surprisingly peaceful. Mom cooked dinner. Dad helped mow the lawn. They thanked me constantly, every little thing. It almost felt normal. For the first time in years, we ate dinner together without Ashley. No arguments, no comparisons, no guilt trips. Part of me actually started believing maybe they'd changed. Then, on the 5th night, I woke up thirsty. It was almost midnight. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the living room. Mom and Dad were whispering. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but then I heard my name. So I stopped. Dad sighed. We can't stay here forever. Mom nodded. I know. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. But eventually, this house will be ours anyway. I froze. What? Dad sounded uncertain. How? Mom lowered her voice. He's our son. If we convince him we're sorry, he'll let us stay permanently. And once we're living here, it'll be much harder for him to ask us to leave. I felt sick. Everything, the gratitude, the apologies, the kindness. It wasn't genuine. It was strategy. Then Mom laughed softly. And if he gets married someday, we'll just remind him family comes first. Dad actually chuckled, just like we always did. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They still hadn't learned. Not after losing everything. Not after Ashley robbed them blind. Their first instinct was to make themselves dependent on me, again. I quietly walked back to my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I replayed every conversation we'd had that week. Every apology. Every thank you. Every promise they'd changed. None of it felt real anymore. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. Mom smiled. Good morning. I smiled back. Morning. She asked what I wanted for breakfast. I thanked her. Inside, I'd already made my decision. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted peace. I asked one simple question. If I let my parents stay with me, could they ever claim rights to my house? The lawyer didn't hesitate. Protect yourself. Get everything in writing. That was all I needed to hear. The next evening, I placed a folder on the dining table. Dad looked confused. What's this? A simple occupancy agreement. It says you're guests, not tenants, and that you'll move out in 60 days. The room became completely silent. Mom's smile disappeared. Dad didn't even open the folder. Instead, he slowly pushed it back toward me. Then he looked me straight in the eye. We're family. We shouldn't need paperwork. I calmly replied, exactly. If we're family, signing it shouldn't be a problem. Neither of them touched the pen. Not for 1 second. Finally, Mom whispered, you don't trust us. I looked at both of them, then answered with the only truthful response I had left. I did. Dad stood up so quickly his chair nearly fell over. His face turned red. So, that's it? You think we're trying to steal your house? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence said everything. Then Mom did something I never expected. She burst into tears. Not quiet crying, full sobbing. She pointed at me and shouted, this is Ashley's fault. You would have never treated us like this before. For the first time in years, I raised my voice. No, this is your fault. You spent 30 years teaching Ashley that she'd never face consequences. And now, you're angry because I won't let the same thing happen here. Neither of them said a word, because deep down, they knew I was right. That night, they packed their bags, but before they left, Dad turned around at the front door. His eyes were full of regret. Or maybe, for the first time, understanding. Then he quietly said, "I think we lost both our children." I looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "No, you lost one. You pushed the other away." He lowered his head and walked out into the rain. I watched from the doorway until their car disappeared. I thought that would be the last time I'd ever see them. I was wrong. 3 months passed without a single word from my parents. No calls, no texts, no emails. Honestly, life felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next family crisis. I thought the story was finally over. Then, my phone rang. The caller ID simply read, "County Sheriff's Office." I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, "Hello?" A calm voice replied, "Is this Michael?" "Yes, I'm Detective Harris. We've located your sister." For a moment, everything around me went quiet. After all this time, Ashley had finally been found. The detective explained that Ashley hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been hiding in another country. She'd been living under her own name, in another state. She'd rented an apartment, bought a used car, started working remotely, as if she'd simply started a brand new life. I asked the question everyone wanted answered. Did she still have the money? The detective sighed. No. It was gone. Gone, just like that. Years of my parents' sacrifices, spent in less than a year. Luxury apartments, designer clothes, travel, expensive restaurants, gambling, bad investments. When the money ran out, she tried opening credit cards using fake information. That's what finally got her caught. A few days later, the detective asked if I'd be willing to give a statement. Not because I was a victim. Because I'd known Ashley better than almost anyone. So I agreed. When I arrived at the station, I expected anger, defiance, excuses. Instead, Ashley looked empty. She'd lost weight. The confidence she'd always carried was gone. For the first time in her life, there was no one left to rescue her. She looked at me and actually smiled. A tired, broken smile. "You came." I nodded. I wanted answers. She laughed quietly. I figured. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked, "Why? Why Mom and Dad? Why take everything?" She looked down at the table, then said something I never expected. Because I knew they'd let me. I didn't interrupt. She continued, "My whole life, they never told me no. If I wanted something, I got it. If I made a mistake, they fixed it. If I blamed someone else, they believed me." She wiped away a tear. I stopped seeing them as parents. I started seeing them as a bank account. Those words hit me harder than I expected, because they were true. Painfully true. Ashley looked at me again. "You know what's funny? I used to think you were the lucky one." I frowned. "Lucky?" She nodded. "They expected nothing from you. They expected me to be perfect. Every award, every achievement, I had to keep proving I deserved being the favorite. If I ever failed, I was terrified they'd stop loving me. For the first time, I saw something I'd never noticed growing up. Ashley hadn't just been spoiled. She'd been trapped too. Not in the same way I was, but trapped all the same. Their love had always come with conditions. Mine was withheld. Hers had to be earned, over and over again. That still doesn't explain stealing everything." She nodded. "It doesn't. There isn't an excuse. I just kept thinking they'd forgive me. They always had before." That sentence stayed with me, because it explained everything. She hadn't suddenly become selfish. She'd simply taken the lesson our parents had spent 30 years teaching her to its logical conclusion. A week later, the court hearing took place. Ashley pleaded guilty. She received a prison sentence. When the judge asked if anyone wished to speak, my parents stood. For the first time in my life, Dad didn't defend her. He looked directly at the judge and said, "We loved our daughter, but we failed to raise her." Then Mom spoke. "We thought protecting her meant loving her. We were wrong." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, not because Ashley was going to prison, but because 2 parents had finally admitted the truth they'd spent decades avoiding. After the hearing, Dad walked over to me. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted to tell you, you were right. We spent so much time trying to give Ashley everything that we forgot to be parents." Then he looked at me with tears in his eyes, "And we forgot to be yours." For years, I'd imagined hearing those words. I thought they'd make everything better. They didn't. Some wounds don't disappear because someone finally apologizes, but they can stop getting deeper. I didn't hug him. I didn't suddenly become one happy family again. Instead, I simply said, "I appreciate you saying it." That was enough, for both of us. Over the next year, my parents rented a small apartment. Dad went back to part-time work. Mom found a job at a local library, not because they had to prove anything, because they needed to rebuild their lives. This time, without pretending someone else would save them. We talk now, not every day, not even every week. Sometimes we have coffee, sometimes we don't. Our relationship will never be what it could have been, but for the first time, it's honest. No favorites, no guilt, no pretending. As for me, I still live in that little 2-bedroom house, the one Mom once called cute. A few months ago, my parents came over for dinner. When they left, Dad stopped at the front door. He looked around the house, smiled, and quietly said, "You built a beautiful home. Not cute, not good enough, beautiful." It was a small sentence, 28 years late, but it was real. People always ask if I regret refusing to save Ashley. I don't, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences they've spent their whole life avoiding. And sometimes the hardest lesson parents ever learn is that protecting a child from every consequence doesn't save them. It only delays the damage until everyone pays the price.